We keep hearing about illegal tariffs, but what can we actually do if they are imposed upon Canada? Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, political columnist with the Toronto Sun. Joining me to unpack the issue of tariffs and their legality, their illegality, is Professor David Collins. He is a professor in international trade law at the University of London in the UK. Joins us from that beautiful city now. Professor, thanks for the time.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Uh, Donald Trump is going to enact some sort of tariffs. And I guess part of the problem in trying to decide what's legal, what's illegal, do any countries have remedies, is he talks about so many different types of tariffs. There's the reciprocal ones that he was signing an executive order on when I was down in Washington last week. There's the steel and aluminum tariffs slated to come in a few weeks. Then there's the other tariffs that could go on everything. So uh, the steel and aluminum ones, he uses what's called Section 232 and declares it's a national security issue. Does that make them legal in some way, or does Canada still have a remedy under our trade agreement with the United States?
Well, this is one of the most controversial areas of international trade law now. It's the notorious Article 21 of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which, of course, is the original trade agreement from the mid 20th century. And that provision essentially allows countries, the way it's worded, to do whatever they want if it's in the interest of essential security. And it's framed in what's known as self-judging language. So this means that the country can determine whether or not there's an essential security emergency. So, in theory, that provision would provide cover for potentially any kind of trade action that the U.S. president or any other country would enact. But then you have a question of, is that justiciable? Meaning, could one of the WTO panels, could the WTO court hear a case about whether or not that was legitimate? And they could, but I think it would be very, very hard for another country to successfully bring a claim against the US on the basis that Article 21 had been breached. In fact, it wasn't
Well,
an essential security
and
situation.
wouldn't they just ignore any ruling they didn't like anyway?
Yes. Yes, that's the unfortunate thing about international law is it's only really functional insofar as states are prepared to follow through with it. And of course, in a way, sadly, the US was one of the initial creators of the World Trade Organization, the International Rules-Based Order for International Trade. But no, I think you're absolutely right. It's very unlikely that the US would adhere to a ruling of a WTO panel were they to lose. And they've ignored them in the past, as have other countries, to be fair. But yeah, it's only going to account for so much.
One thing I know about trade law, and it would be a thimble compared to you, is that countries like to complain to each other and about each other on these panels, whether it's the WTO or the CUSMA, USMACA, whatever we're calling NAFTA now. In fact, right after we signed the agreement, the Americans complained about us. A little while later, we joined Mexico complaining about them. It is
Yeah.
back and forth all the time. The Before we get to the potential for tariffs on all goods and services coming out of Canada into the US. I mentioned the executive order that Trump signed last week on reciprocal tariffs. That was mostly thought to be about Europe and India. And I actually understand where he's coming from on this. They have some very high tariffs on American goods, and the Americans have low tariffs on those goods. And his view seems to be, well, we'll charge you whatever you're charging us, so let's make it fair. Is that something that these countries can complain about to the WTO? I mean, if India is charging, I think it was on motorcycles, 100% tariff, and the Americans charge a 5% tariff on Indian motorcycles, I think there is an issue of fairness there. That doesn't seem like a good deal for anyone.
No, you're right, but I think the issue here is that it's not so much the word complain. You wouldn't complain to the WTO because nothing has been done illegally. What's happened is India simply hasn't made as profound tariff commitments as what the US has done. And India is probably amongst the worst offenders, certainly of the big economies. All this means is those countries have bound higher tariff levels as part of their WTO commitments. They haven't done anything wrong. It's just that's what was negotiated. And what President Trump is saying is, well, we're just not happy with that. It's not fair. In theory, the solution would be, well, let's all go to the WTO in Geneva and let's have a meeting and let's negotiate to have the tariffs down, 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 down. He's not doing that. He's saying, no, we're going to tariff you unless you drop them. And in a way, it's great for the rest of the world because now, if India or, for example, the EU, which the EU has dropped it has lowered its tariffs on automobiles under the most favored nation rule, that's Article 1 of GATT, every country in the world benefits from that. So by Donald Trump being the strong man, all of the other countries in the world benefit from the lower tariff that the EU has offered, or
But
potentially maybe that India is going to end up offering.
so some of the cars made here in Canada now face a lower tariff if they get exported to Germany, let's say.
Yes, exactly. Canada would benefit from this lower tariff. The EU's dropped its tariff on cars from 10%, I think, to 2.5, 3.5%. Canada will now benefit from that. So we should be thankful in a way that President Trump has done that for us.
The two surprise things in that executive order. One was the digital service tax. We knew the Americans were unhappy, but they're going to look at some way of considering that um, a tariff, and they may, charge us back. I'm not sure how that will work because we don't have those sorts of businesses, the Googles, the Netflix. Crave isn't, selling any subscriptions down in the United States. But the value added tax, um, I've never heard a complaint about the GST. Is this about the European Union's value added tax, or could we be caught up with the Trump administration saying the GST is a form of a tariff, and so we're going to tariff you on
Well,
exports to the United States?
they seem like similar issues, but in many ways they're completely different. On the digital services tax, President Trump is absolutely right, and I've said this long before the tariffs, writing this years ago, or when the digital services tax first came out. That probably is illegal. It's discriminatory against U.S. companies by the way that it's structured because it only hits the big tech companies, and it's essentially a discriminatory tariff against U.S. digital exports,
And there's a couple of
digital
Canadian
services.
companies that get captured, but it is primarily aimed at big tech, and that's what they were
Yeah.
always talking about.
Yeah, and they've said this. And when the OECD was coming up with the rules for the digital services tax, they called it a tax. They designed it as a tax to hit the big US companies. So he's right about that, and Canada
And the
should
Biden
eliminate the
administration
GST.
complained, and they warned us, and in fact, they took us to a Kuzma panel on it, right?
Yeah, there is a Kuzma panel that was instigated last summer, and we'll see where that goes because you've got the WTO track, you've got the Kuzma track, and we'll see where that goes. But I think that's a totally legitimate claim. They have a very strong case. The VAT, the GST, no, this makes no sense. These are not tariffs. They're applied to domestically consumed goods. They're not border measures. Labeling it a tariff is completely insane, and this, I think, to me at least, I think this undermines some of the stronger arguments that the Trump administration has about unfair trade when they make these outlandish comments like that.
One of the things that was interesting in actually going to Washington and talking to people is that you get a different sense. You get a sense on the ground. I started to hear support, not for 25% tariffs across the board on Canada, but there was some support, and it was bipartisan. Not all. There's a lot of people opposed to the tariff situation, but talk of let's go to a universal 10% tariff. It'll be good for the country. It'll be good for the economy. Um, do we have to worry about that? I mean, that would be a big change from decades of American economic positioning.
Well, in my opinion, and I think most economists would support me on this, there's no good tariffs. The tariffs are really a damaging policy. 10% is better than 20% across the board. In theory, I guess it might be somewhat easier to administer. It might be more predictable and easier to adapt to, but all tariffs are damaging. And in the case of US tariffs, Canada is going to be hit very hardly because Canada is so deeply interlinked with the US economy. So there's really no good answer. If we could negotiate down from 25 to 10%, I think that would be a major achievement. But ultimately, tariffs are going to be damaging. And of course, the Americans are going to suffer as well. They won't suffer as much as the Canadians do, but it's going to be more expensive for American consumers. And it's going to decimate all these supply chains that have
Yeah,
been in
well, the
existence for all these
thinking that I
years.
was hearing, and this is what worries me, is the thinking supporting it is no, it won't be more expensive for us because our dollar will go up in value and your dollar and everyone else's currency will go down in value. So in the end, our purchasing power gets bigger. and you're going to absorb the cost. That's worrisome because that's the thinking driving this. And if that happens, they'll be right, and we're going to be hurt badly.
Well, I think with respect to the Americans, I suspect that the analysis that you just articulated, which I think is potentially broadly accurate in terms of obviously if the Canadian currency is devalued, it makes Canadian exports more attractive. I doubt very much that was actually featuring in the American strategy behind the tariffs. I think maybe they're obviously aware that that could cushion some of the blow, and it might cushion the blow for us. But I think ultimately what the plan is here is it's to use the tariff as leverage, probably for the USMCA renegotiation. And I would suspect this will be similar to what happened in 2018. We'll see a newer version of the USMCA in which Canada has probably made some concessions that it might not have otherwise made to deal with the tariffs.
And is that perhaps our best remedy long term? Not the WTO, not a panel, just renegotiate the deal.
Well, I think absolutely go with the WTO cases. China apparently has brought or is bringing a claim against the U.S. for the tariffs that it imposed on China. I would say absolutely instigate the WTO and USMCA complaints because I'm a believer in using international mechanisms to resolve disputes. Probably won't go anywhere, but yes, I think to answer your question, the renegotiation of the USMCA is probably Canada's best bet. And I would suggest that that be brought forward. It's supposed to happen in 26. Let's do it now. It would help, obviously, to have a functional federal government in Canada, but that's something that should be done soon.
All right, Professor, thanks so much for the time today.
Thanks a lot.
Let us know what you think about what you heard. Drop a comment down below, share this on social media, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.